This is Becoming Antifragile with I.J. McCon. Each week I read a book and highlight the actionable wisdom within. To become anti-fragile, you must strengthen your mind and live with conviction. Let's get into it. Your soul is oftentimes a battlefield upon which your reason and your judgment wage war against your passion and your appetite. Would that I be the peacemaker in your soul, that I might turn the discord and the rivalry of your elements into oneness and melody. But how shall I, unless you yourselves be the peacemaker, nay, the lovers of all your elements? Your reason and your passion are the rudder and the sails of your seafaring soul. If either your sails or your rudder be broken, you can but toss and drift, or else be held at a standstill in the mid-sea. For reason, ruling alone, is a force confining, and passion, unattended, is a flame that burns to its own destruction. Therefore, let your soul exalt your reason to the height of passion, that it may sing, and let it direct your passion with reason, that your passion may live through its own daily resurrection, and like the phoenix rise above its own ashes. I would have you consider your judgment and your appetite, even as you would two loved guests in your house. Surely you would not honor one guest above the other, for he who is more mindful of one loses the love and the faith of both. Among the hills, when you sit in the cool shade of the white poplars, sharing the peace and serenity of distant fields and meadows, then let your heart say in silence, God rests in reason. And when the storm comes, and the mighty wind shakes the forest, and thunder and lightning proclaim the majesty of the sky, then let your heart say in awe, God moves in passion. And since you are a breath in God's sphere and a leaf in God's forest, you too should rest in reason and move in passion. This is an excerpt from The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran. Kahlil Gibran is a poet, philosopher, and artist. He was born in Lebanon, born 1883, died 1931. He was considered a voice that called for unity and also for people to think deeply and to love strongly. He was also, interesting enough, almost excommunicated and considered a rebel for his views by the Maronite Catholic community. But when he died in 1931, he was considered a brother by the Maronite community. And at his funeral at Bsharri, Lebanon, it ended up bringing many religious leaders from all faiths to come and honor a man who wanted unity, who wanted peace, who wanted others to share in kindness and in love. Gibran's writing was instrumental in sparking a renaissance in Arabic literature and is one of the most read poets after Shakespeare and Lao Tzu. And The Prophet, the book that I have in my hand, has never been out of print since it was released. It's been translated into over 100 languages, making it one of the top 10 translated books in the United States. We covered the second most translated book in the world, which is The Prince by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. The Prophet is also the best-selling book in the 20th century in the United States. So when I was researching Gibran's life and the book, turns out that he's had a very strong impact in culture. So Elvis Presley apparently loved Gibran's poems and gave hundreds of thousands away to people. Johnny Cash also loved Gibran's work. Gibran, being an artist, drew Carl Jung and Rabindranath Tagore, who is an Indian polymath. Gibran was also considered a political revolutionary. One of the fascinating things that I found out was that the famous JFK quote, John F. Kennedy's quote, when he says, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." That is taken from one of Gibran's articles. So Gibran wrote an article called "The New Frontier," the new frontier in Lebanon, when he was in Lebanon. And I'm quote, "Come, tell me who and what are you? Are you a politician asking what your country can do for you? Or are you a zealous one, asking what you can do for your country? If you are the first, then you are a parasite. Is the second, then you are an oasis in a desert. Very clear here that JFK borrowed from Gibran. That's because JFK loved Gibran's work. By the time that Gibran died at the age of 48 from cirrhosis and tuberculosis, he had achieved literary fame both in the US and also in Europe, reminiscent of Leo Tolstoy's fame by the age of 50. So getting more into the details of the Prophet. The Prophet is 26 poetry fables, and it follows a story, right? It's not just disparate poems, but it follows a story of Al-Mustafa, a prophet who has lived in Orphalese for 12 years and is about to return home because his ship is here. And as he descends from his mountain towards the shore, he is stopped by the townspeople and he engages in conversation with them. And the townsfolk wants him to impart wisdom on multiple areas of life, such as love, death, marriage, children, giving, eating, drinking, work, joy, sorrow, house, clothes, buying, selling, punishment, law, good and evil, prayer, pleasure, beauty, self-knowledge, death, religion. And he engages them and gives them his wisdom. And that poem that I read in the beginning, that is the poem called Reason and Passion. And it's a beautiful poem. Right in the beginning it says, "Your soul is oftentimes a battlefield, upon which your reason and your judgment wage war against your passion and your appetite. Would that I be a peacemaker in your soul, that I might turn the discord and the rivalry of your elements into oneness and melody. But how shall I, unless you yourself be also the peacemaker, nay, the lovers of all your elements?" To me, what Gibran is getting here is that you must unify your light and your shadow. You must become one. You must not emphasize one or the other. You must not go to the extreme of only going towards reason and judgment and then ignoring your passions and your appetites. Because for Gibran, to be fully human is to embrace both of these things. To be both ruled by reason and by passion. Passion here is like the passion that you have for, say, your craft. The appetite you have for wanting to experience something beautiful. This idea of harmonizing your light and your shadow, your reason and your judgment. This is a theme that comes up over and over again in the Prophet. Because Gibran, one of his main points is to emphasize individuality, is to emphasize your uniqueness and for you to embrace it. And we'll get to this, but Gibran's philosophy, just based on the Prophet and a few others that I read, it seems like Gibran is trying to find a middle way of not overemphasizing one thing over the other, not overemphasizing detachment as the Stoics would, and not falling over and embracing passion only or becoming an Epicurean. The other thing in this poem that I liked quite a lot was when he said, "Therefore let your soul exalt your reason to the height of passion, that it may sing, and let it direct your passion with reason, that your passion may live through its own daily resurrection, and like the phoenix rise above its own ashes." He's getting at this interplay between passion and reason and how both of them, if you can cultivate them to be together, if you can exalt your reason to the heights of your passion, then you can make your reason even more powerful and much more impactful. And if you can allow your passion to be directed by reason, then your passion will live and rise daily, and you will never run out of passion. There's that wisdom in here where you are not being driven by one or the other. You are allowing reason, rationality to direct the passions that you have, so you are not engaging in things that would be damaging to your reason. And you're calling your reason to rise high to the level of your passion. In so doing, you become much more thoughtful, much more deep thinking. And that's something that Gibran wants you to do. So in the opening of the Prophet, as Al-Mustafa is coming down from the mountain, he says, "How often have you sailed in my dream He's talking about his ship. And now you come in my awakening, which is my deeper dream. Am I ready to go? And my eagerness with sails full awaits the wind. And the way I read this, the ship that arrives as Al-Mustafa's is a metaphor for death. And Al-Mustafa is ready for death, and he's been preparing for death for the past 12 years. And so for us, when you've contemplated on your mortality, like Confucius says, if you reflect on your death in the morning, then at night you'll be ready for it. What you end up realizing that death is simply the birth of a new dawn. Like, we don't know what happens on the other end of death. But in you being able to be at peace with it allows you to embrace death when it happens. The sense of mortality, as we've mentioned before, is a good setting stone for us to live a life that we will not regret. A life where the actions that you take are not taken out of fear, but you're able to take actions, you're able to make decisions to love more deeply, because you know that time is short. You know that the things that you do it because you love them, and you're not doing it because you're forced by somebody else. But you can only really do this if you've reflected on your mortality. And so when we move into love, and on the poem of love, he says, when love beckons you, follow him. Though his ways are hard and steep, when his wings enfold you, yield to him. Though the sword hidden among his pinions may wound you, for even as love crowns you, so shall he crucify you. Even as he is for your growth, so he is for your pruning. Even as he ascends to your heights and caresses your tenderest branches that quiver in the sun, so shall he descend to your roots and shake them in their clinging to the earth. Gibran's point here is that to love deeply, is no easy task. And you can see a big difference between infatuation and love here. If you're infatuated, it's not going to do or have much of an impact on you. One is like a mist and the other is an ocean. And love being like an ocean, when you give yourself to love, what you will end up seeing in yourself is all the parts that you want to hide, all your flaws that you want to hide, they will come to the forefront. Yet it is in this very act of giving yourself to love that your flaws are refined, they're molded, they're shaped by love. And through that, you peek into divinity. I think there's something beautiful when he says, for even as love crowns you, so shall he crucify you. I think no man enters heaven if he has no love. It doesn't matter how perfect his philosophy is or how sound his theology might be. Without love, the gates remain shut to you forever. Hence, Gibran's emphasis on love. This idea of love comes up over and over again throughout all of his poems. He says, fill each other's cup, but drink not from one cup. Give one another of your bread, but eat not from the same loaf. Sing and dance together and be joyous, but let each one of you be alone. He's saying, give yourself freely to your loved ones, but don't expect something in return. When he says, but let each one of you be alone. This is a repeating theme in the Prophet. Gibran stresses the importance of individuality, of being alone, insofar as you mustn't depend on the rigid doctrines to direct how you live, to direct your thoughts. Right? So when you love and when you give the bread. Don't participate in the bread that you've given. Like, don't expect to eat from it. And when you're singing and dancing together, learn to also sing and dance by yourself. And we're going to get to this point about solitude later on in this episode. So he says, when you love, you should not say, God is in my heart, but rather, I am in the heart of God. And think not you can direct the course of love. For love, if it finds you worthy, directs your course. I mentioned in a podcast that I did with a friend of mine, Jim Madden, where we were talking about loving our wives. And either him or I had mentioned that we don't love our wives because we love God. We love our wives because we love our wives. So like, I love my wife because I love my wife, not because I love God that I love my wife. Because even if it turned out that God didn't exist, it wouldn't change my love for my wife. If my wife dies and I curse God and I reject God, I wouldn't love my wife any less because I rejected God. I would love her just the same, if not more. And that's why when Gibran says, when you love, you should not say God is in my heart, but rather I am in the heart of God. That stuck with me. And I was thinking about it. You don't love because God is in your heart, but you love because you are the heart of God. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. So moving to a different poem, and the poem on children, he says, your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you, for life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bow from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves the bow that is stable. As a father, seeing my daughter grow is one of the most beautiful things, and obviously this poem stuck out to me, and I read that poem multiple times. You know, you are keenly aware that your children are going to grow up and leave this house just as you left your parents' house and now are living your life. And what I liked about this specific poem was when he says that you cannot force your thoughts onto your children. And you should probably know this. When your parents have tried to force some thought onto you, you end up usually rebelling. And so instead, what Al-Mustafa is imparting here is that you should give your children the love. And for me, one of the things that I want to impart on my children is the love for wisdom. And as we read in Proverbs, which is episode 11, you know, King Solomon is telling his children to love wisdom and to always seek her because she's better than gold. She's better than anything. Because in finding wisdom and in living in the presence of wisdom, your life is going to be better. Because the decisions you make, the things that you do, the things that you think about are geared towards the beautiful things, are geared towards the good things, are geared towards seeking truth. If you can do this, then you will live a virtuous life and you will live a long and prosperous life. So in this poem, when he says, you are the bow from which your children as living arrows are sent forth, there's a lot of things packed in here, right? First thing that I wrote down was, you bestow onto your children the things you want them to understand. You prepare them for the world so that when they're sent forth from you, that you will know that they will live a virtuous life long after you've died. And as a parent, that's what you want, right? You want your children to love deeply, to live in wisdom, to have wisdom, to be kind, to stand up for truth, to defend the weak, to be anti-fragile. And for them to do that, you have to be a stable bow, as he says, right? So that the infinite can shoot your children through it. I like that poem specifically, and I recommend reading that poem. Moving on to a different section, and now Al-Mustafa is talking about giving. And to me, this is related to the whole children thing and to love as a whole. He says, you give but little when you give of your possessions. It is when you give of yourself that you truly give. For what are your possessions but things you keep and guard for fear you may need them tomorrow? Your most precious asset is not your wealth, is not your possessions, it's your time. And so to give yourself is to give your time. And to give your time is to give yourself. And that is the insight that Gibran is teaching through Al-Mustafa. Right? It is when you give of yourself that you truly give. Because when you give of yourself, that is the most precious thing to you. The time that you have is the most precious thing. And that is the greatest gift that you can give to someone. If you think of all your best friendships, none of them are bought by money or by fame or by wealth. It is the opposite. It is likely the friendships that you built when you didn't have anything. It is built through the sacrificing of your time. It is built through the pouring of yourself into the friendship. And this is why you hear stories of people when they acquire a ton of wealth, they become quite weary of friendships because they cannot tell who their real friends and who their real friends from their fake friends, right? You tend to draw a lot of attention when you have a lot of wealth, friendships that normally you wouldn't be friends that normally you wouldn't be friends with. And so Gibran obviously sees this and understands this as somebody who achieved literary fame before his death. And so the way you tell the difference, and for you to get to the point where you have true friends, Gibran wants you to do that through giving of yourself. And so he says, there are those who give with joy, and that joy is their reward. And there are those who give with pain, and that pain is their baptism. Right? And for those of us who find it difficult to give, it's even more important to give. Right? Whether that's of your time or even of your possession. For it is only in giving that your heart grows. And it is through that you are able to expand your love. Within most religious traditions, there's this idea of giving back, whether that's tithing, whether that's giving back 10%, 20%, 15%, whatever it is. And the idea is that what you acquired, what you earned, is not yours to begin with. And so you must give back, and you're giving back to the church or to the mosque or to the synagogue, to the temple. There's something beautiful about that because it builds within the individual, within the psyche of the community, that really this life is not about acquiring and keeping everything to yourself and being selfish, but it's rather about giving back. Because it is in the act of giving that there is joy that you get, and it is the act of giving that you develop your character. It's well known that when you give your money, when you give your time to some charity, you feel a much deeper sense of meaning by doing that. And that's why there are all these charities and foundations that get built by people who acquire a lot of wealth. Because they get to the point when they realize that, yes, having all this is great, but what's more important is actually doing something with this to give back. Because ultimately, nothing that you own, none of your possessions are yours. You're simply managing it until you die, because when you die, you can take nothing with you to your grave. And the only thing you can take with you is your character. And for us, it is the character that we are building. And one of the ways we're doing that is through giving. And so Gibran says, you often say, I would give, but only to the deserving. The trees in your orchard say not so, nor the flocks in your pasture. They give that they may live, for to withhold is to perish. Right? Gibran's point is that you must give without expectation, and you must give freely. Do not withhold, do not be greedy, both in your possession and with yourself. And one thing that I wrote down was, if you have a jam-packed calendar, and that makes it impossible for you to make time to cultivate deep friendships, reconsider your calendar. Right? No man who reaches the end of his life wishes that his calendar remain more full, or that his calendar remain continuously full until the very last breath. But every man says that he wished he had deeper friendships, because the fact is, the older you grow, the more alone time you're going to have, and the less friends that you're going to see, and the less friends you're going to have. One, your friends are going to die. And two, the older you get, the less likely you're going to travel to see your friend, because distance is going to play a huge factor. You imagine for a second spending your whole life without deep friendship, and then you get old. And then at that moment you realize, like anything in this world, because you haven't sacrificed your time into building up friendship, you no longer have the friends that you thought that you have. So Gibran says, and let your best be for your friend. If he must know the ebb of your tide, let him know its flood also. For what is your friend that you should seek him with hours to kill? Seek him always with hours to live, for it is his to fill your need, but not your emptiness. And in the sweetness of friendship, let there be laughter and sharing of pleasures. For in the dew of little things, the heart finds its morning and is refreshed. I thought that was an excellent way of putting this whole thing together, where your friendship needs to be in honesty. If he's going to know the ebb of your tide, then he has to know the floods. If he's going to know your joys, then he should also know your sorrows. He says, seek not your friend when you want to kill time, but seek your friends when you want to live, when you have hours to live. Share the joys, the sorrows, the ups and the downs with your friend. For in the dew of little things, the heart finds its morning and is refreshed. Gibran's poem on joy and sorrow is quite moving. It is only in my reflection, years after, that I can see beauty in the suffering. In my mind, I knew intellectually I could apprehend that there might be beauty, but my whole being never attained to that same level until a few years ago. So if you are suffering now, I am sorry for your pain and the aching in your heart. There are very few things that soothe the suffering, and words are often not one of them. The part of the section in this poem that stood out to me was, the deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives? Gibran is very different than the Stoic and Buddha when it comes to suffering and love. He doesn't want you to detach yourself from the world, from the reality of suffering and from love. It's quite the opposite. He wants you to embrace it fully, to grab onto it, to soak in everything, to feel the knife carving the lute, to feel the heat of the oven, because it is only then do you realize that that is how the wine is held in this cup, and that is how you enjoy the wine, and that is how the beautiful music that comes from the lute, it was through the carving of the knives. And you embrace it not because you can see the future, not because you can see that the future is going to be beautiful, but you embrace it because you trust that in the suffering there will be beauty. And there is a sense of trust, right? It's not, you can never foresee anything, because if you never know how long the whole process is going to take. Gibran's goal in The Prophet is to reveal to you the full spectrum of human life and how you can be fully human. And the way for him is the way of balance and harmony. It is not that you are going to detach yourself, going from one extreme of detaching yourself from suffering. And neither are you going onto the other side of wallowing in your sorrow forever, or pretending that there is no suffering whatsoever and only embracing hedonistic pleasures. So he says, for you can only be free when even the desire of seeking freedom becomes a harness to you, and when you cease to speak of freedom as a goal and a fulfillment. You shall be free indeed, when your days are not without a care, nor your nights without a want and a grief. For Gibran, freedom is not unattachment, as the Buddha and the Stoics teach. The strength of freedom rises when you embrace it. And so he says, thus when your freedom, when it loses its fetters, becomes itself the fetter of a greater freedom. And on suffering and pain, I quite like this specific sentence when he says, much of your pain is self-chosen. It is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. Therefore, trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility. And in this specific section, you can see some similarities with, say, Epictetus, where the idea is that much of the suffering that you have is within yourself. It is in your imagination, meaning it is in your mind. But Gibran goes a step further and says, it is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. Right? It is in you, it is through your suffering that you become well, but you must do the work. Sometimes the path to healing is through the suffering itself. And then at least that is what I've found. Going now to a different poem on work, he says, "Always you have been told that work is a curse and labor a misfortune. But I say to you that when you work, you fulfill a part of Earth's furthest dream assigned to you when the dream was born, and in keeping yourself with labor, you are in truth loving life. And to love life through labor is to be intimate with life's inmost secret." When I read this, it was this idea that I've been thinking about for a while. Is the modern notion of work that we have is quite agrarious. It makes you think work is a means to an end, right? That's what we think most of the time. That we go to work because we have to make the money, and we go to work for some sort of specific utility only. But I think what Gibran is getting here, and work is not a means to an end, but it's an end in itself. When you love life through labor, it is to be intimate with life's inmost secret. Because work, to me, is an active participation of your entire body, your entire person in the act of creation, right? The focus is not only on the financial outcomes, but also on the act of creating something meaningful, something lasting. And when you do that, you end up loving the work. And some people think that loving work, there's no such thing as work that you love. But I completely disagree. I think when you are doing your life's work, you end up loving the process. You end up loving the work itself. You don't become a workaholic in the same sense where you abandon your family, you abandon your friends to go to work, but the work itself makes you a better person. And if you can do work like that, there is satisfaction and fulfillment because both your intellect and your body are now engaged in this process of work. And so Gibran writes, "What is it to work with love? Is it to weave the cloth with threads drawn from your heart, even as if your beloved were to wear that cloth? Is it to build a house with affection, even as if your beloved were to dwell in that house?" This one stood out to me because, in our society, we've severed the bond between you as the creator and your creation. Work has become a means of acquiring material possession. And this connection between the creator and his creation, between you and what you create, has led and continues to lead to a soulless existence where anxiety is the norm, where waking up on a Monday is dreaded, where trying to rest on a Sunday is dreaded because you're thinking about the next day. And weekends become a fleeting rest from the draining work week. Whereas the work that Gibran is talking about is work where it makes you a better person. It fills you up. It makes you feel alive. And so he goes on to say, if you do not work with love, then he says, don't work at all. And I like this one section from that poem. And I quote, "If you bake bread with indifference, you bake a bitter bread that feeds but half man's hunger. And if you sing, though as angels, and love not the singing, you muffle man's ears to the voices of the day and the voices of the night." What Gibran is getting here, the insight that he has, is if you are able to find work, or if you do work that you find to be your life's calling, that is a different type of work, because any time that you are doing it, you have your passion, you have your love behind it, and you're doing it to the fullest ability, to the best of your ability. Whereas if you do something that you don't want to do, that you're doing simply as a means to an end to get more, to collect more prizes, that type of work is not worth the malice that your soul develops. He wants to encourage you to say, when you work, work with all your being connected to it. Take charge of that work and create the best that you can create. He has a poem about food and eating, which reminded me of how easily in the West we take food for granted. And partially that's because we have divorced the work of the hands of the butcher and the people who are buying it from it, right? So because you can now just go to a grocery store. You can find all the meat that you want to buy without ever having to kill the animal yourself or clean the animal. There's no blood, there's no bones, they're simply nicely packed. But this numbs us to the reality of life, that when you look at life as a whole, you can see the cyclical nature of it. We eat food to nourish our bodies, but then when we die, our bodies, when it's buried, nourishes the ground, and then the ground gives life. And what Gibran in this poem beautifully says is that we should be reflecting more deeply on the food that we eat and how we're eating it and how we got the food on our plate. And I think we should do this, especially in the West, where you don't have to actually kill your own food. And the reality is most of us don't hunt, and even if we do it for game. You're doing it more so because it's a choice, right? And you have the ability to do it. Whereas people who have to kill their own food, or maybe hunt their own food for nourishment, they do it because one, they actually need it, and two, the hunt in itself ends up instilling in you respect for the food that you killed and the food that you're going to partake in. Whereas for us in the West, we lack this, and because we do, we tend to have very little respect for the food. And so I'll give you an example of when I was younger. I had to kill my own chicken at one point, and that was, at that age, one of the worst and best things for me, because that experience almost turned me into a vegetarian. I felt guilty for having to kill this chicken and having to clean this chicken, and I hardly could eat dinner that night. And the thought of becoming a vegetarian, to the thought of never having to kill another animal, became very enticing to me. But when I considered becoming a vegetarian, there was this one thing I realized, and it was that if I became one, I would have to still kill plants to nourish myself. And further, some life beyond the plant had to be taken so that my nourishment was not going to be destroyed. When I was tending my garden, I would still have to make sure to kill all the bugs and all the mice so that they didn't eat my plant. And as a result of that, I ended up not becoming a vegetarian. So Gibran says, "Would that you could live on the fragrance of the earth, and like an air plant sustained by the light. But since you must kill to eat, and rob the newly born of its mother's milk to quench your thirst, let it then be an act of worship. And let your broad stand an altar on which the pure and the innocent of forest and plain are sacrificed for that which is purer and more innocent in man. When you kill a beast, say to him in your heart, by the same power that slays you, I too am slain, and I too shall be consumed. For the law that delivered you into my hand shall deliver me into a mightier hand. Your blood and my blood is naught but the sap that feeds the tree of heaven. And when you crush an apple with your teeth, say to it in your heart, your seeds shall live in my body, and the buds of your tomorrow shall blossom in my heart. And your fragrance shall be my breath, and together we shall rejoice through all the seasons. And in the autumn, when you gather the grapes of your vineyards for the winepress, say in your heart, I too am a vineyard, and my fruit shall be gathered for the winepress. And like new wine, I shall be kept in eternal vessels. And in the winter, when you draw the wine, let there be in your heart a song for each cup. And let there be in the song a remembrance for the autumn days, and for the vineyard, and for the winepress. I thought that was beautifully written, and brings together this idea that when we partake in anything, right, whether that's a simple meal or a table full of food, there should always be gratitude in your heart. And I think this idea of being grateful for your food is a small token that you can do daily. The other poem I wanted to highlight was this poem called Self-Knowledge. And in it, he has this line, and I'm quoting, your hearts know in silence the secrets of the days and the nights, but your ears thirst for the sound of your heart's knowledge. You would know in words that which you have always known in thought. And that line stood out to me because Gibran is getting at this one thing we've spoken about before. And it's that it is in silence, it is in your solitude that you can understand deeply the knowledge about yourself that you have suppressed, that you have hidden. And it is in the solitude. Now, without solitude, what ends up happening is that your ears thirst for the sound of your heart's knowledge. And so Gibran says, you would know in words that which you have always known in thought, but your ears can only hear when you are silent. And so that's a call for us. That's a call for you and I to continue to cultivate solitude in our lives. You can live your whole life distracted by your work, by goals that you set for yourself, by your relationships, and get to the end of life and realize that you've never once found solitude. And on your deathbed, when it is just you and everybody else has gone home, you might find solitude for the first time in your 80 years. And it's not a little too late then. It's never too late to find solitude. But you will wish that you had more time in silence before that time. So Gibran says, you talk when you cease to be at peace with your thoughts. And when you can no longer dwell in the solitude of your heart, you live in your lips. And sound is a diversion and a pastime. There are those among you who seek the talkative through fear of being alone. The silence of aloneness reveals to their eyes their naked selves, and they would escape. We are continually distracted by noise in this world. And the distraction works, and the distraction is profitable because people simply do not want to be alone with their own thoughts. Because they are afraid of who they are. They are afraid of realizing that they are not living the life that they want to live, that they are not the man or the woman that they want to be. You have to go into that shadow, to sit in silence. And you can only do that by dedicating yourself to the practice of being alone with your thoughts for an extended period of time. Something that I've spoken about before is me doing a silent retreat, and I recommend doing it even if it's just once a year or twice a year. Do yourself a favor and commit to a silent retreat. And it doesn't have to be fancy. You can be in your condo, you can be in your house, you can be in your backyard, you can be in your cottage. Dedicate at least 2 days where you can spend it by yourself. Not talking to anyone, not checking emails, not watching TV, not listening to music. The only thing you really need are some clothes, a book, a pen, a notebook. And if it's possible, don't even use audiobooks then, because you're listening to somebody else's voice. What we want to do is we want to sit in silence so that we can hear our own voice. And the way that I do it is in the morning, I'll pray, I'll meditate, then I'll write, then I'll read. Then I'll write again, eat some food. Then if it's summertime, then I'll go for a walk. Come back, repeat, write, read, eat some supper, and then read, and then write, and then go to bed before 10 p.m. And do this the next day. And if you do this, I cannot guarantee that something profound will happen, but I will say that you will find a well of wisdom springing forth from you, from yourself, from within. When you start reflecting and writing, you start to connect things that you have not been able to connect because you've been so busy. And you will also find strength, because solitude, being by yourself is not easy, and being silent is even more difficult. All the noise creeps up, all the negative talk starts to arise, and that is when it is even more important for your higher man to overcome your lower man. And Gibran has this quote from a different poem. He says, and that's why these silent retreats are important, because it allows you to build up some sort of mental, spiritual muscle, so that you will not be tempted or seduced in the future by things. So Gibran in one of his poems says, it is when your spirit goes wandering upon the wind that you, alone and unguarded, committed a wrong unto others and therefore unto yourself. And he says in a different poem, for what is evil but good tortured by its own hunger and thirst? Verily, when good is hungry, it seeks food even in dark caves, and when it thirsts, it drinks even of dead waters. And the reason for the solitude, for the silent retreat, is that it feeds your soul. And when your soul is fed, it is not hungry and it will not seek out food in dark caves, or neither will it drink water from dead waters. Right? Because it knows where to find the good food. It knows where to find living waters. And so Gibran says, and even as each one of you stands alone in God's knowledge, so must each one of you be alone in his knowledge of God and in his understanding of the earth. The point that Gibran's making is nobody can call the distractions away, the noise in your life, but yourself. And only you, truly you, can be alone in his knowledge of God and in the understanding of the earth. Gibran's poem on self-knowledge has a section where he says, say not I have found the truth, but rather I have found a truth. Say not I have found the path of the soul. Say rather, I have met the soul walking upon my path. For the soul walking upon all paths, the soul walks not upon a line, neither does it grow like a reed. The soul unfolds like a lotus of countless petals. He's getting here that there isn't just a single truth in this life. That if you find truth, you have found a truth, not the truth. And when you're walking on the path to finding meaning, to finding purpose, is that you must walk. And when you have started walking on the path, as he says, say not I have found the path of the soul, but say rather I have met the soul walking upon my path. There will be people walking on the path, on different paths, and it is you, once you've attained this understanding, that you have found a truth, that these folks are not necessarily walking on the wrong path in their search for truth. A teacher comes up and says, speak to us about teaching. And in that poem, he's talking about how the point of the teacher is to teach you, the students, to walk the path themselves. And so there is this one line. He says, no man can reveal to you aught but that which already lies half asleep in the dawning of your knowledge. And that is my hope with this podcast, is that I'm simply revealing to you the half asleep knowledge that is already within you. And the podcast is simply a catalyst for that. And there is a poem that I came across of Gibran's that has two versions. There's an old version and there's a new version that has been translated by Sierra Taylor, Emily Canley, Eric Berens, Sarah Walters, Tamara Fletcher, and Afanash. And their translation of this poem, which is not found in the Prophet, but this poem encapsulates what we've been talking about. Not just in this episode, but as in the podcast as a whole, where the goal of our life is to live within every single moment the fullest that we can. And so I'm going to read this poem to you. Love not a half lover, nor befriend a half friend. Indulge not in the work of the half talented. Live not a half life, nor die a half death. Choose not a half solution, nor stand in the middle of a truth. Dream not a half dream, nor cling to a half hope. If you choose to be silent to the end. And if you choose to speak, speak to the end. Let not your silence speak for you, nor your speech silence you. If you agree, express your agreement. Do not feign your acceptance. A half life is a life you have not lived. A word you have not said. A smile you have not expressed. A love you have not felt. And a friendship you have not known. A half life makes you a stranger to intimates, and intimates strangers. A half life is what you reach but never attain, and where you strive but never succeed. It is where you are both absent and present. It is where you are not yourself, for you have never known yourself. And thus, whom you love is not your true soulmate. A half-life is where you are present in different places at the same time. A half-drink does not satisfy your thirst, nor a half-meal your hunger. A half-path leads you nowhere, and a half-thought yields no result. A half-life is a moment of weakness, but you are not weak, for you are not a half-person. You are a person. You exist to live a full life and not a half life. And with that, I'm going to wrap. My challenges for you this week is to look at your calendar and find a weekend where you can do a silent retreat. And the second one is take a moment before each of your meals and be grateful and reflect on how that meal came upon your table. And the last challenge is when you go to work tomorrow, the day after, work with your full being present. So thank you for listening to this episode. I appreciate you. If you haven't already, subscribe and give this podcast a review on Spotify or on Apple. And if you've enjoyed this episode specifically, send it to a friend. Until next week, peace.